Hello, we're going to go ahead and reconvene, and I know that there's a lot of good conversations happening outside of this room, but I also know what great speakers we have coming up yet here. And so hopefully our voices will start pulling people back in. And so it is my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce you to Dr. Anna Navas-Acien. Anna and I met in a little bit of a strange way. I have contacts at Columbia University, and I've worked with folks there for the last 15 years. And I was doing my visits out to Columbia as I usually do, and as some of you know, I try to get out to New York as absolutely much as possible to keep an eye on my 19-year-old. And they said, hey, we've got a new faculty member, and she's done some work in American Indian Health. So obviously, you know, it's kind of assumed that we all would know each other, which is actually more often the case than not. And we started talking, and within 30 seconds, I identified Missouri Breaks, La Best, Cheyenne River, and all these different connections, Oglala Sioux Tribe. And I was like, oh, you've got to come talk at the summit, because this is an area that I've got a lot of interest in with our involvement in the new ECHO study, as well as just would be great to have your voice be part of the summit. So Dr. Anna Navas-Acien is a physician epidemiologist and a professor of environmental health sciences at Columbia University, Mailman School of Public Health. Her research investigates the long-term health effects of environmental chemicals, their interactions with genetic and epigenetic variants, and effective interventions for reducing involuntary environmental exposures. For more than 10 years, she has been working on metal-related research in the Strongheart Study, a population-based cohort study of cardiovascular disease and its risk factors in American Indian communities in the Northern Plains, the Southwest, and the Southern Plains. Oh gosh, I almost only listed the Northern Plains, but the other places matter too. Southwest and the Southern Plains matter too. Her research goals are to contribute to the reduction of environmental health disparities in disproportionately exposed populations. So please help me welcome Dr. Navas-Acien.
So thank you, Amy, so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here today. I am really, I feel very, very privileged to have this opportunity. And as Amy said, for many years I've had the real privilege to work with the Strongheart Study. And when I started this, I was trained in epidemiology, and I was trained in environmental health. And as a young scientist, I was interested in understanding how the environment affects disease. And none of the work that we have done really would have been possible for me personally without the Strongheart Study. The Strongheart Study has been a tremendous asset and opportunity to advance this field of the role of the environment in cardiovascular disease. So what I wanted to do today is to show you some of the research that we have done, how we've been doing this work, and also some of the lessons learned. And during this session today, it's been really amazing for me to hear back and to learn again what some of the important issues are. And despite some challenges, how the research actually can be done, and especially how the research hopefully help us to benefit the communities. That I think is something that is really important. And none of this, as I said, the Strongheart Study really facilitated this work to be done. And the work that we do as scientists, especially when you work in public health, is, this is not working. Let me make sure that, okay, very good. The work that we do in public health is a team science work. And I really like this picture. It was taken in Eagle Butte, where one of the field sites for the Strongheart Study is. And you can see the team is composed of community members and scientists, all of us working together. You can see that the faces kind of say a lot because everybody looks quite happy. And you can see that there is a sense of belonging and of being partners in this work. It's not easy because, you know, we have a lot of discussions. And actually, of all the different groups I work with, I would say the Strongheart Study is one of those groups where there is the most discussion. But the discussion is extremely important because the discussion means that people are open, that people are transparent, that when there is no agreement, the discussion is actually needed, and everybody is listened. And if we listen to each other, at the end, there is going to be some kind of agreement, and people feel that the voices have been heard. And I think that's very important. And then we can have common goals and fight for those goals. I think it's Malia Vilega said that, that you need to have a goal, you need to have something that you want to look for, something big. And I think that's in many ways how the Strongheart Study works. And I think for that reason, that's why they've been very successful in working with the communities for such a long time, despite many difficulties along the way. So myself as an environmental health scientist, I like to think in that way of this collective effort and all the disciplines, all the interdisciplinary effort that we have to do to move the science forward. So I generally work in exposures, environmental exposures, and epidemiology and medicine to look at these connections. But we cannot just look as associations, and the work that we do in research with human populations is very challenging to understand. What are we really discovering something important, or is there all bias? And so we really need to work with other disciplines to understand the basic sciences. Are extremely important to understand that the work that we do in human settings. And of course, we are in this world where we need to understand genomics, epigenomics, and other disciplines that help us to identify mechanisms that might help identify populations that are more susceptible. So we need to work as a team with those disciplines. But none of this work would be useful scientifically if we don't use it for interventions, for really moving the science forward to help the populations, the communities, the individuals. And that's very challenging to do. And moving the science from the science to the field and the prevention or the intervention requires additional disciplines to help us understand the social norms and how things can actually be changed. And that's why I strongly believe the social science have important role to play, and doing the intervention research to know what is effective. So those are kind of, I put in these hexagons, these kind of scientific disciplines that interdisciplinary have to work together. But none of this would work if we don't really have the trust, the partnership, and this sustainability that has been mentioned several times today for really making this effort meaningful and actually possible. And I have to say I am very grateful as a scientist from having worked with the communities in the Strongheart Study, because this is not something that we are taught. We don't learn that in the university. When you get your PhD, you learn a lot about all these disciplines. Nobody really teaches you this importance of that trust and the partnership and really having that commitment with the communities. And I am just grateful. It's something that I've learned, and I think maybe things are changing a little bit. I want to be optimistic. I think educational programs, universities are maybe incorporating this better. But I think when I was trained myself, like 15, 20 years ago, that was not part of the message that I got. So as you probably know, many of you know the Strongheart Study. It started in 1988. What is actually very impressive to think that is almost 30 years working together with with 13 tribes and communities in multiple states. And actually, when you think of the way the Strongheart Study works with this community engagement and participatory research framework, this happened before community-based participatory research was actually defined. But the Strongheart Study already kind of adopted that model early on, and the reason was because otherwise they could not have done the research. It's something that really the communities have demanded for a long time. They've been really always ahead of the curve, I think, American Indian communities in that regard. So it's very impressive, and it's one of the largest studies, especially for cardiovascular disease. And these are some pictures that show a little bit how the communities are very different. We are in the northern plains here, but in Oklahoma, it's more like small towns, communities. And in Arizona, some of the communities have actually become relatively wealthy through the casino industry. So there is a lot of diversity in the communities. But at the same time, the communities have managed to continue working together for all these years. And when you look at this is just a diagram that shows you how the study was initially, the initial cohort was recruited in the late 80s, followed up for 10 years, that's in blue. And then at the late 90s, they thought, because the cohort originally recruited individuals 45 to 74 years of age. The reason that happened is that because in a way, the Strongheart study was funded by NHLBI, and NHLBI had done the Framingham study that most of you probably know because it's very famous. And there was this idea of doing other cohorts kind of similar in diverse populations. And the Framingham had recruited people 45 and older, and so that's why kind of the study started. But the communities and the Strongheart study realized that there was need to recruit younger populations. So in the late 80s, there was this new phase of recruitment that included any participants. They started like 14 years and older. So adolescents were also recruited. And so I write there this issue of sustainability that I mentioned earlier and how continuous funding has been critical. Otherwise, the cohort could not have been continued. And something I want you to pay attention is the number 64% baseline response rate. This is an incredibly high response rate when you think that all the community members in some of the tribes and in some others only a subset, but were invited to participate. So how can you achieve this high response rate? I think it's through this trust and the community engagement and the collaboration with the communities. And over the follow-up, it's 90% retention rate. That's, again, you need to have, participants need to have that trust, otherwise you could not manage to achieve these very high response rates. So myself, and so the Strongheart study has shown many important, provided very important knowledge in cardiovascular disease in American Indian communities. This is comparing to another cohort study that is called ARIC that recruited whites and African Americans in several communities around the US. And you can see that there was a high burden of disease and even subclinical disease, also even at younger ages. So the Strongheart study has provided very important information to advance and the management and the prevention of cardiovascular disease through classical risk factors for cardiovascular disease, including diabetes, hypertension, and actually some of the findings from Strongheart study have contributed to clinical guidelines that have been adopted from the Indian Health Service. There have been also clinical trials that have evolved to improve the clinical management of disease, and that has been very important. But myself, I am an environmental scientist, and what I wanted to do is environmental health research, and traditionally, cardiovascular disease cohorts funded by NHLBI have not really paid too much attention to environmental risk factors. It's only, I would say, in the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century that paradigm from the very traditional behavioral risk factors and the more physiological type of risk factors has switched a little bit, and there has been an increased interest in understanding the role of the environment in cardiovascular disease. And I would say it's particularly because of the evidence on the air pollution and cardiovascular disease. That was critical, and also the evidence for secondhand tobacco smoke and cardiovascular disease. Those important environmental risk factors have increased this awareness. So when in 2006, I was a young faculty member, starting my career, and I can see Dina here. I was a faculty at Johns Hopkins, and we had the pleasure of being together when she was doing her PhD there. And in 2006, I was very fortunate because there was an MPH student who was an engineer who knew much more than me, who was a young faculty member, who was working with the Indian Health Service in Nevada, actually. And for his capstone, he put this table together looking at the importance of community water systems, tribally owned community water systems that were affected by arsenic. And I was doing arsenic research myself, so you know how they assign the capstone students, somebody decided that he should work with me because he was interested in arsenic, but as I said, he knew much more than me because he was an engineer and working on that issue. And that table was really important because it documented that there was an important problem with arsenic exposure in American Indian communities, maybe because of the rural problem, because many rural communities in the US are also affected. So the other thing that happened that was very important to me is that one day I was talking to a cardiovascular epidemiologist who used to work at NHLBI. And I was telling him, I want to do research on environmental risk factors for cardiovascular disease, on arsenic in particular. And he said, why don't you do work in ARIC? ARIC is the study I showed you a few slides ago. And I said, you know what? No, because there is no arsenic in the ARIC communities. Why should we do a research in a place where the problem doesn't exist? That doesn't make any sense. And he told me, what about the Strongheart Study? And I was, the Strongheart Study? I had never heard of the Strongheart Study. And I was really disappointed. I had never heard of it because I did my training in cardiovascular epidemiology. I learned about all the cardiovascular disease cohorts, Framingham and ARIC and MESA and many others, but nobody during those classes, lectures, had told us, the students, in the early 2000s, that the Strongheart Study existed. So I was really disappointed. But when he told me about the Strongheart Study, this is very important. And I was able to make that connection because of the engineering student who was an MPH student. And if you look at this map, it shows you groundwater arsenic levels in the states and in the areas where the Strongheart Study communities are located, supporting that there could be potentially higher arsenic exposure in those communities. So we submitted a grant, and but nobody wants to give you the money if you don't have any pilot data, what makes sense. So we had to prove that this research was actually feasible, and I think that's something that is reasonable to ask. So we did the pilot study. We selected 20 we were able to use the biospecimens. We had to be approved, first of all, by the Strongheart Study Steering Committee and by the community members that are part of the Strongheart Study Steering Committee that the research was possible. And we were able to go back to the biospecimens, the urine samples that had been collected over 10 years, since the late 80s to the late 90s, Arizona, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas. And we found that these participants over time, first of all, there was difference in exposure levels. There was higher exposure in Arizona, lower in Oklahoma, and high variability in the Dakotas. But that the most important finding was that, let me see if I can make can you see? Oh no, the problem is that it's not useful because we have 3 screens. So, so this doesn't work. So if you look at each line, the lines are kind of parallel. That's telling you that each participant has very constant exposure levels over time. So that's telling you it's a chronic exposure. Some individuals were exposed to high levels, some individuals were exposed to low levels. What does that do to health? We don't know. We didn't know. Arsenic is a well-known poison and toxicant, but at these levels of exposure, the evidence was not sufficient. Arsenic is in the water, it's in the groundwater, it's in the water that people are drinking. But it doesn't taste, it doesn't smell. How are we going to know if arsenic is toxicant or not? This issue, I think this is an example where you actually need science, because it's only through a hypothesis and the testing of that hypothesis that you can understand if this is a toxicant or not. And I remember that when we were putting the proposal together, Barbara Howard, who was the PI of the steering committee at the time, she said, you know what, your study, at the beginning she was not, these environmental issues were hard for her. She was afraid that the communities would say it's something environmental and would not pay attention to other risk factors that are important. But she also said, this is important because, your study will test it and you find increased risk, or maybe you find no increased risk. So we will actually be able to know if this is something we should care about or maybe not worry too much. So we proposed to do the research. And this is just a slide that about what I mentioned earlier, this increased recognition that environmental exposures are important. And you can, this is the WHO put this together, indicating that around 31% of the cardiovascular disease could be related to environmental health, environmental exposures. And some chemicals are included, but the evidence is still not sufficient for arsenic, so actually only lead is included in those estimates from WHO. I'm going to skip this. So you may wonder, why is arsenic important? And so the reason why it's important is because it's in the water. So many populations are exposed through drinking water. And it's actually also in food because rice, especially rice, uptakes arsenic in the grain. So it's an important exposure for many populations. And also arsenic is very toxic to many different organs and systems. And the heart and heart disease have long been suspected to be affected by arsenic. So when we started this work in the Strongheart Study, the evidence available came from populations. You can see this dark red and then a little bit of a lighter red in the later years, came from populations exposed to very high levels of arsenic. So we didn't know if in populations such as American Indians that were exposed to moderate levels, so levels that were slightly above, in some cases, to the current standard in drinking water, would cause disease or not. So these are some of the other populations that were kind of informing us the hypothesis. You always need to have some prior knowledge in order to have a testable hypothesis. So the other thing that was important to do is to be able to measure arsenic well. So we were using the urine samples collected in the Strongheart study, but we needed to understand how exposure happens. So arsenic is actually methylated in the body. That means that you are exposed to a form of arsenic that is called inorganic. That's what it's in the water. But in the body, it's actually going to be methylated. You are going to have different species, and that's what you find in the urine. So by measuring the inorganic, the monomethylated, and the dimethylated, you can assess if people were exposed or not to arsenic. And this is complicated, and I know you are like, oh my goodness, this is more arsenic thing than what I wanted to learn in my life. So I am sorry for this, but I am explaining this a little bit because I want to talk about genetics later on. And for that, we need to understand what happens to arsenic in our body to understand why genetics makes sense. So that's the reason why I am telling you a little bit about this. So we went ahead and measured the arsenic species and the arsenic in the urine of the Strongheart study participants. And then, you know, you are a scientist, you work so hard to get the grant funding, and finally the data comes to you. Finally, the team is able to look at the data. That's a very important moment, and to learn from those findings. And this is what we found. Here we have the quartiles. This is dividing the arsenic levels in 4 groups. The people with the low levels in the quartile 1, Q1, and the people with the highest levels, Q4. And this is after adjusting for all other potential risk factors. Unfortunately, we found that individuals exposed to higher level had a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So the hypothesis that we had was confirmed. Another important question that is important for the EPA when they do the regulations for arsenic is, what is the dose response? Is there an increased risk or is there a threshold? So this is something that we try to do looking at these dose response curves. But the main point that I want to do here is that there is a lot of uncertainty at the low levels. And this might be a little bit hard for you to understand exactly, but it's for some of you probably it's very easy to see that with the confidence intervals at the low end, we can see clearly that there is high risk at the high end, but at the low end, there is a lot of uncertainty. So that means we've advanced our knowledge on arsenic and cardiovascular disease, but there are still many questions that remain. Experimentation, this is an observational study. There could be biases and confounding and other factors that we don't understand well. But the findings are supported by experimental work, where you can see this is arsenic levels in the water given to a mice model, and they also have higher risk of arsenic, of atherosclerosis. There is also in epidemiology, we always want to have consistency. Can you find similar findings in another population? And a few years ago, they were able to do a similar study in rural Colorado. These are communities that are white and Hispanic communities in rural Colorado, and the same kind of dose-response relationship was found with higher risk of cardiovascular disease related to arsenic exposure levels. So this provides some additional evidence. And now I want to talk about something. When you have multiple studies looking at similar things, it might be good for us to think about data sharing. And that's something that has also come during the discussions today, that I think it's something that is very important for the communities in how this is actually done. So we've put together some meta-analysis to try to look at those data together with working all the studies together. And the reason for indicating that science is needed, and scientists want to share data and they want to work together sharing their data, is because one single study might not be enough and might not cover all, for instance, all the exposure levels that we need. We're not going to cover all the potential different backgrounds that might be relevant. So by combining, we can increase statistical power. We might be able to look at other interactions that are important, either by genetics or by nutrition or other factors, maybe even cultural, sociocultural factors. So consortium of scientists are needed. At the same time, I don't think we can do it in any way or in the terms that scientists would like to do it. I think we need, if we do data sharing, we need to understand what the concerns of the communities are. And that's something that I am extremely thankful to the Strongheart Study communities, because that's something that I didn't know either when I started this work. And I was very naive as a scientist. I would just tend to think data sharing is always good. Why would you need any restriction? But I've learned, so I am so thankful for that you need to be thinking a little bit harder before just doing that unrestricted data sharing. So some of the things that, some of the questions I've been asking people, my colleagues, I would ask them, who do you think owns the data? And people invariably tell you, we own the data. We, the scientists, we own the data. Some people would say, oh, maybe the institutions own the data. They say that because, when you want to share data or biospecimens across institutions, you need to do a data transfer agreement. So then they think, oh, I might not own the data. That's kind of sad to think that the institutions owns it. Some people would say, oh, the government owns the data because NIH is requiring us to do data sharing. So the government is giving us the money. But if the government owns the data, then the people must own the data. So then we should just put the data for everybody because the people own the data. And what I learned from working with the Strongheart Study communities is that, for the communities here, they own the data. They own the data. And we are scientists, we need to be grateful that the collaboration exists, the partnership exists, and we need to respect that. The community owns the data. And we need to think of how do we share the data then, in which terms. Does that mean that the communities don't want to share the data? I don't think so. The communities might be willing to share the data, but not just in that unrestricted way where they would lose control of how the data is used, for which purposes. So I think if there is a clear goal and there is clear control and understanding, I am still optimistic as a scientist that we can actually maybe share data and use the data in ways that are important. And again, the questions need to be important. The questions need to be important for the scientists, but the questions most of all need to be important for the communities. And so those are things that I'm going to repeat it again. I am very grateful because I never thought about those things before I had the opportunity to interact with many of you in this room. So thank you. And then the last thing is this idea of who profits from research. And sometimes, you also think that this naive kind of thinking that research is good for society. and that's why we should do it. But I think it's important to think who is really benefiting from it, and think if the communities want to participate and contribute to science, they really need to benefit one way or another, and they need to see that benefit. Otherwise, the partnership doesn't work. If only one side benefits, this is not a real partnership. No? So I have some reference there that I believe these are papers from actually from Spiro Manson's team, and I believe also some of the papers that I believe Dr. Perez-Table were also involved, that have recommendations that are very useful. And actually, these recommendations from the experience working with the Strongheart study actually work. So I think, and I was very grateful to the panel that we just had before from the Indian Health Service, from the different IRBs and experiences, because I think it's been very positive. And I am, again, always grateful to have those reviews. It gives you some confidence that you can do the science if it has gone through them. It's not just the universities' IRBs, but it's really the community's IRBs. So I think that's is very important. And this issue at the end, the review of publications and lay summaries, I think it's very good that scientists, we have that kind of extra check-in. It's not just a peer review system from scientists reviewing the science, but it's also the communities reviewing the science. And I think it's, again, the American Indian communities are ahead from many other communities through having that process, that system in place. And especially when you do environmental work, as is my case, it's even more important because the environmental exposures rarely happen at the individual level. And currently, the consent forms that we have in place generally protect individuals, but they are not so good at protecting communities. So if you have an exposure that is in the air or it's in the water, and you are now publishing your findings, you are kind of marking communities. You can stigmatize communities and by publishing those findings. So what does the community has to say when those publications go out? So I honestly think that the work that you are doing here and the system in place, it's very important for many communities around the world because of those concerns about protecting the community, not just protecting the individual. And the value of traditional knowledge, I think, is very important. Last year, there was this workshop organized by NIHS about traditional ecological knowledge that was very important to make scientists aware. And I think it's some of the examples that Spiro Manson mentioned earlier, this evidence-based practice and this idea that how the traditional knowledge needs to inform the practice-based evidence and how that knowledge needs to inform our evidence. So there was this article in Nature that kind of acknowledging that the indigenous people need to benefit from science. So I think there is some awareness that this needs to happen. And I want to come back to that, to this issue of benefit and how our science needs to go back to benefit. So how many more minutes do I have? Because I think I am done. Yes, very good. So I am going to go very quickly now over my last slides. And I wanted to talk about genetics and diabetes, but I won't be able to do it. However, I want to show one, because I think the issue of genetics is very important. I want to show one slide. So we did a metabo chip. This is data from the Strongheart study. All of this has been approved by the communities. And all the papers have been approved by the tribes. And you can see this is a signal showing this is a Manhattan plot. And this line that goes above the red and the yellow lines tells you that there is a very important genetic determinant of arsenic methylation. That means that not everybody is going to handle arsenic in the same way. So we are now working, and the question is that's genetics, but also is modifiable too. And we can have nutritional supplements that can modify the way people handle arsenic and the methylation process. So potentially there could be some interventions that could be developed. But the most important intervention that we want to think about is how we can actually remove arsenic from the environment. That, I think, is the most important element that we need to really focus our energies on. And one way to do it is through policy for the whole country. So the EPA is actually doing a new risk assessment, and they asked data from the Strongheart Study, and the Strongheart Study approved to share the data if it was in their own terms and provide aggregated data, not raw data. The other important achievements is for the Pine Ridge Reservation has been through the Mini-Witoni water pipeline and the providing better water for the community. So that's very, very important. But still, there are many families who rely on groundwater. So we are now working on an intervention study to provide drinking water, arsenic-safe drinking water to families, and all that work was done through partnership and collaboration, and Marcia O'Leary has been really influential, and Missouri Breaks in making that work possible. So I just want to show some of the materials that we have developed. We are now in the pilot phase, so we are installing filters in many households around the communities. And this, in addition to that, is not just giving a filter. The most important piece is probably providing educational materials and helping the families to use the water filter appropriately. So we've been through a formative research phase. We've been including the input from the communities, and we are really excited with starting the project now. Actually, you can see some of the materials in the booth outside from the Strongheart Study. You can see some of the materials that we've put together for this trial. And I'm going to skip this. And I am just going to show a few things in addition, and now I promise I finished. And if we focus on arsenic, that was something that was of interest to us, but somebody said, what are actually the priorities? Are there other priorities? Some of the issues in North Dakota with the fracking and the natural gas and the oil, with air pollution, that's an important one. So recently also we got some requests from the community to work on mercury. And I think that the tribes, I think they want to do their own research and they should take the lead. And then the scientists will be, if you want to partner with us, I think then we can partner with you. I think this needs to go in both ways. Sometimes the scientists, we have questions, and we ask the communities, are you interested in, do you want to partner with us to answer those questions? But other times it should be the other way. You can see that these are some serious issues that are going on in the communities. And this is near Lyle Best, who is here, household. So he gave me this picture, so thank you. So I want to thank the communities for making the research possible and for their contribution to the research questions and the actual conduction of the research. And our responsibility as scientists is to help with that and being engaged for the benefit. The funding, of course, that makes the science possible in many ways. And I also want to thank the students because, and all the collaborators in the Strongheart Study, in the Strongheart Water Studies, many people involved. But I especially want to thank students. I think students, they really drive the science, and they have this continuous energy. When you become older, you tend to kind of want to be in your comfort zone. But when you are in an institution with students around, they are always pushing for new ideas and new work to do. So I am really very thankful to many students who have moved this science forward. And I don't have in this picture Joe Racheta, who is now doing his doctor PhD, and I am really excited to have him as part of the team. And I feel like, you know, somebody like Joe who's so experienced, how do we think he's a student? He's doing his doctor and his degree and all of that, but he's really, I am the one who is learning from him. And I feel again, like with this engineering student that I had the opportunity to work and who made this, in academia, it's not clear who's the student and who's the faculty, because I think we are all working together to learn and see what needs to be done. So thank you very much, and I hope you have questions. I don't know, maybe there is no time, so thank you for listening then. Thank you.